Welcome to the Raw Rugby League podcast. I'm Meehall Wood, and today we are dealing with a topic that will, in all likelihood, change the face of rugby league as we know it. Concussion, and more importantly, the way that head contact is managed and officiated in rugby league. On this podcast, we shy away from the hot take and the immediately topical, but in the last few weeks, we have incidents that have inadvertently put this subject right at the top of the agenda. Before the season started, a video went viral of a Super League send-off with New Brown, the Kiwi test hooker, dispatched for an accidental head clash. How we left? They've all gone soft over there, right? Well, in round two, we saw Wasiliev knocked out in the first tackle of the match by an accidental head clash with Cam McInnes. It barely merited a mention because who cares about a fringe bulldog front rower, right? Well, in round three, we saw Reece Walsh, one of the game's biggest stars, fracture a cheekbone in the opening stages of the grand final rematch from an accidental head clash. And suddenly, head contact mattered a little bit more. Of course, concussion doesn't care how good you are. This kind of contact, the head-on-head, is what all the data says we should be trying to get out of the game. And our guest today is like a voice from the future, because in the UK, they've already started that process. That man is Robert Hicks, head of legal and operations at the Rugby Football League, a safeguarding lawyer by trade, and a former referee with not too much experience to be the list here, but grand finals, Challenge Cup finals, the World Cup, the lot. Welcome to the show, Robert Hicks.
Hi, Mike. How are you?
I'm all right. That was a very long intro. That's the longest intro I've ever done. It's like an Oldham Referee Society meeting from about 2003, this.
A long while ago, Mike. It is.
Or a tea break from about 2009 when we were colleagues together at the Rugby League. My tea breaking hasn't got much better, I'm afraid. But yeah, so you've been, obviously, you're front and centre of this in the UK. And I think for Australian listeners, it's best to just kick off with what is happening in Super League and why is it happening? Because I think it's been a pretty major change as of the start of this year. And I think, canary in the coal mine is the phrase that comes to mind.
Yeah, I suppose, Mike, the reality of this in the UK is that this has been coming for a number of years. Unlike the NRL, which is a global megastar, Super League is a sport that battles against rugby union quite significantly over here, battles for airtime and battles for the broadcast rights, and therefore has a limited amount of money it can spend in some areas. It also faces legal and insurable challenges, as all collision sports in the UK do now. We're not alone in that regard. The RFU are in the same boat. We've seen it globally with the NFL. So over the last 4 years, we've been as a body trying to make the game as safe as possible for our participants, while still not trying to lose the fabric of the game, the collision, the whack that everybody loves. And that's been an interesting challenge. But about 12 months ago, based on the data from the research assistants that were out there, that the RFL employed and the other sports employed, it became apparent that all collision sports, rugby union, rugby league, AFL, NFL, the biggest issue is when heads of players are in the same space. That's what the data tells us. It causes twice as many concussions as heads near hips, heads near knees, and basically upright tackles where you've got a ball carrier and a tackler stood upright with their head in the same space. On a rate basis, causes 1.2 times the amounts of concussion compared with hips and knees, which is 0.5. And actually what we found was that the safest place to tackle is where the traditional rugby league tackle used to be, which was around the ball and the waist, like the abdomen area of a player. But what we're trying to achieve over here is basically a reduction in the tackle height by about 5 to 6 centimeters, because when you try and hit somebody in the shoulder, if it goes wrong, you hit them in the head. If you try and hit them around the ball, if it goes wrong, you hit them in the shoulder, and that's much safer for us. So that's really been where it's been going. And as you've probably now seen, we released 44 recommendations that the RFL board approved in November across a number of areas. By the way, some of these things that are already done in Australia, safe play code, tackle below the armpit up to under 15s, all those kinds of things. But the one thing that's been majorly different over here this year is penalising head on head, because the laws of the game say a tackler can't hit a ball carrier in the head, and it doesn't say what he can't hit him in the head with. It just says he can't hit him in the head.
Yeah, and it's more of an interpretation change rather than it is a specific rule change to something which was always illegal. And I think it's more it's not that Super League has necessarily changed because it wants to change, although you'd like to think that it wants less players to get injured and less concussions to occur. But there is the other imperative around the insurance part, which is such a big, I think there's a much more driving factor in British Rugby League because there's less money involved in terms of, insurance is a global marketplace, and players running into each other and getting knocked out quite a lot is very difficult to insure.
Yeah, it is, but insurers are there once they're happy that the game is as safe as it can reasonably be. It doesn't want to change the fabric of the game, but it has to be satisfied you're doing enough to reduce that risk. And concussion is the highest reported injury according to our injury audit, has been for the last 2 years. We have a concussion every other game in Super League. We know that most of those are caused when ball carrier and tackler are upright. There's a lot of data and evidence why we would try and do this. And the RFL created a brain health committee last year to interpret mouthguard data, to understand head acceleration impacts. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is make the game safer for the people that play it.
Yeah, I think there's a point in that, because I know there was a sort of viral video that went around here of Willie Mason, the former Australian international, sort of going on, footy players are a different breed, and they, wear the 1% of the 1%, the warrior code, all this kind of stuff. And I thought, yeah, that's probably true. Like, you've spent your working life with rugby league players. I've spent most of my working life with rugby league players, and they're different guys to everybody else, different men and women. But that's kind of why the rules exist, is because you need to protect these people from themselves a little bit. Because I think we've seen over my sort of, 20, 30 years of watching rugby league is the rules become safer and safer and safer. And I don't see why that's suddenly going to change now, right?
Yeah, I think a bit of that's right as well. I think the other thing as well is all the rule changes over the last decade or more. I refereed in Super League from 2011. It was always about making the game faster, putting more fatigue into players, keeping the ball in play more. The Six again did that, get rid of the wrestle, make the game as quick as possible. You've got to balance that with some safety elements, and some of the things that we did that were subtle over here this year. We went back to basics, players playing the ball with the foot, because we know that adds a little bit of time onto the play the ball. We tried to get away from the numbers in the tackle with some of our interpretations in the ruck, which was going to speed the game up. But what we wanted to try and do was get less men in the tackle, because it's actually the catch type tackles that cause the issue. And if you watch the NRL over the last few years, increasingly it's moved back to 2-men tackles in more phases of play than 3-men tackles, which was prevalent over here for the last 2 to 3 years. So there's a bit of yin and yang. And as I say, the big thing about this is, yeah, we want to make the game safe, but we want to keep the fabric of the game right. And finding that balance has been challenging over the first few weeks. But the data that we've had over that period of time has shown, look, we know that we have about 3,000 tackle events in a match, 6,000 tackle events, 3,000 per team. We know that therefore 10% of those tackles were making contact with the head. That over the first 6 rounds of Super League is reduced down to 3%. So we've managed to lower that tackle height without having to make drastic changes to certain things, and we may go further yet. But the whole idea behind this is reduce concussions, reduce head acceleration events, because we know it's those things that have long-term effects on players' brains and their overall brain health. And you've heard of players, James Graham's one of them, very, very articulately putting forward what they know about the impact of rugby league on their brain.
Yeah, and I think there's important points to this as well. Like, anyone who's watched Super League this year will see, like, it hasn't taken big hits out of the game. Like, we saw, is it round 1, there was a big complaint about, how many players got suspended, but there was also one of the biggest hits you've ever seen from Tarek Sims on George Williams away at Catalans, and it sort of went around the world as, look at this amazing sport. I think it might have been the same weekend as the Las Vegas games here. No, it was before. But it proved that it hasn't changed the fundamentals of rugby league, and that was a perfectly legal tackle in 1895, and it's a perfectly legal tackle now, and no other sport gives you that collision. It's just crucially it didn't hit him in the head.
And that's the key, isn't it? And this is what we're trying to achieve, to still have big hits, which you can have. And actually quite a lot of our big hits in the game are when players bend the back, drive and whack into the midriff of someone and take them off their feet. We know that they're safe. We know that they're safe because they haven't hit the head, but also because our players are wearing mouth guards over here, we're able to assess the acceleration event that takes place, which caused the subconcussive injuries, and the subconcussive hits over a period of times are the ones that can degenerate the brain.
Yeah, I think it's worth going to that because we have that over here in Super Rugby, in the Rugby Union. And there's been a couple of hiccups with it, where it's given false positives and guys have been taken out. Whereas in the NRL, obviously, you have the bunker watching, the video ref discerning what is a concussion. I know at the weekend, at the time recording, the Roosters are very annoyed about this because Sam Walker got took out of a game when he got hit. They were insistent he got hit on the neck, and it's in the inexact science. Whereas the point of the mouth guard is kind of to be an exact science and say, well, the most of the time this is going to catch it. And I think that's something that's relatively easy to bring in that is already happening in Super League, right?
Yeah, and we've brought mandatory mouth guards in, but we're not using the data live yet because we want to make sure that the data is accurate, what's happening. And we know, for example, we have a player in Super League that triggers a 10G acceleration event by sidestepping. We can see that by correlating the video with the mouthguard data, but a 10G trigger is not very high. World Rugby don't take players off unless they hit 70G. Therefore, so you can see how far up you go. We've had a player this year, we had a head-on-head collision that got 60G for both players. So that's like the equivalent of a car crash. And that was caused by head hitting head. So that's why I come back to where I said they can be the most dangerous types to tackle.
Yeah, I'm wondering who that is now because Will Price is already playing in the NRL. So, playing in the New South Wales Cup because he's the sidestep king from previously. I'm going to go away and think of who the best sidestepper is currently. Yeah, I think so. One of the things that came out from that round one was there was a bit of a backlash from the playing group, which seems to have been really well dealt with by yourself. And so for people who don't know, the Rugby League in England doesn't have an RLPA like we have here. It was a lot more informal. But you've really been on the front foot in terms of making sure that you bring the players with you on this, because that's, without them, we don't have anything. They're the ones who are putting their bodies on the line, and you really have to get buy-in from that group. So maybe explain a little how this has been dealt with, because I know that's something that's going to come up over here.
Yeah, well, I think the starting point is that we have a union over here. It's not as formal as the Rugby League Players Association in Australia, and we have a charity called Rugby League Cares that looks after player welfare on behalf of the sport. Both union rep Gareth Carvell and Rugby League Cares through Steve McCormack are represented on all our decision-making groups, Brain Health, Laws Committee, and all our clubs are involved in those decision-making processes, whether that be through regulatory group, Laws Committee, Brain Health Committee, Clinical Advisory Group, where we have the doctors and all the various different groups that make decisions around what the game will look like. The players have a voice at that level, but what became apparent after we'd made these decisions was they didn't feel as consulted as they could have been. And there was clearly some incidents where they weren't happy. They felt that some of this was needed to be discussed. And I think it's a really positive step. The players are the most important stakeholder in it to a large extent, other than owners of clubs who put significant money in. Without the players, we have no game. Without the coaches coaching it, we have no game. Without referees refereeing it, we don't. So taking those three groups of players with us was really important. And we continue to meet with them. We're trying to engage with them where we can. We've been into every Super League club and given presentations on why we're trying to do what we're doing. We've got a small working group now to try and take forward a much more active players union, and we'll involve them in that decision making, because it's all well and good me saying that we want to make the game safer for the players. The players have to want it to be safer for them as well. So they're involved. I think they understand what we're trying to achieve. I think they wanted to have more involvement earlier, which we have to acknowledge we didn't do enough of. And we go forward and try, and any changes we make, we want their active involvement with.
Yeah, I think it's a point that should, obviously when this happens here, and I've no doubt that it'll be different because we have that formalized structure. And one of the sort of the unseen party in this, if you've got the governing bodies and the players, is sort of the third pillar is the broadcasters, and I think that's something that the UK is kind of ahead of as well, because there is at the same time that all this has been happening, we've had the IMG recommendations has fundamentally changed the way that rugby league is marketed in the UK. I know this isn't a podcast about that, but just for people's sort of background information, we had for the first time all games broadcast, which was previously only half the games were broadcast with full setup video referee at every single game, which wasn't always there. And so you had this strange situation in round one where, on one hand, everyone was going, wow, attendances were up, the product looked brilliant, the content was great, you had really shareable moments like the Tariq Sims tackle on George Williams. But then you also had the sort of diehard fans going, oh, this is totally different to what we've seen before. And I think what's been interesting to see from an outside perspective is the way that you've navigated those two things, because rugby league fundamentally is a televised product that is paid for by the broadcasters. And I'm interested to know what sort of the buy-in from their side has been, if any, in terms of supporting what you're doing and making sure that it's well explained to the public. Because if the punters don't understand what's going on, then it doesn't really help very much.
Mike, change is never easy. That's the starting point of this, and you're fundamentally potentially affecting the fabric of the sport for the die-hard fan. But hitting people in the head has always been illegal, and everybody always says that. But come back to where I said our data showed us that in our sport in Super League, 12% of tackle events were making initial contact with the head or neck. So 12% of tackles were illegal. Now, if that was tackle events, and as I said, 3,000 tackle events, that's about 360. Imagine how many penalties in a match you'd have. So you've got to think this through carefully. You've got to take people with you. We've got Jamie Jones Buchanan, who's an observer on the RFL board. He's on the Brain Health Subcommittee. He's on the Laws Committee. We've got John Wilkin, who we've engaged with quite a lot, who does a lot of broadcast over here. All our broadcasters, we do regular briefings with and discuss things with them. They're reasonably supportive. I think it's like everything. Everybody understands the rationale. They see the direction of travel. They just want to make sure that what happens doesn't fundamentally take away the sport's fabric. And I think, look, we're sat here just after a Challenge Cup round where we've had relatively few charges for head contact. Our head contact charges are down into single figures every week now. The number of bans we've got are down. I think in the last round of Super League, 9 out of the 12 clubs didn't get a charge. So I think we've got a long way down the path of navigating some of that change. And as I say, we're already down to 3% of head contacts out of those tackle events, whereas it was 12%. If we can keep on that direction of travel, keep explaining that to people, we'll all feel a lot better about what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I know over here, I'm sure you're aware of this, a couple of years ago, there was the Magic Round crackdown, as people called it, where suddenly there was a whole weekend of it was happening on Magic Round where everybody was getting sent off, and the only team who didn't get anybody sin-binned or sent off was the Warriors, because they basically said, well, we've already had this happen to us 3 times this season, so we've sort of voluntarily changed how we tackle. So when the changes happened to everybody else, they were ahead of it, and they basically said, well, we trained for this, and it became a big thing. Especially there was a similar outcry about hip drop tackles, and certain other clubs said the same thing. They said, well, we don't train this, and we've never trained it, and we wanted to be ahead of it because we knew this would happen at some point. And I guess when you're going in, this will go into the tackle height trial sort of in the lower grades in a bit, but teams knew that this was coming and have been able to adapt it accordingly. But until it happens in practice, it's really difficult. But you can see how quickly they can adapt when the players started getting suspended,
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the NFL. The NFL have just announced today they're getting rid of the hip drop tackle. Don't know if you've seen that.
I only just woke up.
All the ex-players in the NFL are coming out, how can you tackle this type of player if you don't do a hip drop tackle? Yet Rugby League in Australia and the UK has managed to reduce the hip drop tackle ridiculously quickly, because there's just different mechanics to what you're trying to achieve. That's the same with any type of tackle technique. And look, we all know no coach coaches to hit a player in the head. So actually, back to where we started, we're trying to lower that tackle height by about between 5 and 10 centimeters, depending on where the initial hip contact would be, because we know if you hit, we split our player up into zones. If you hit in zones 2 and 3, if you get it wrong in zone 2, you hit zone 1. If you hit zone 3, you get zone 2. And the game's fast, it's physical. People move up the line. People drop height very quickly. There's a lot that goes into a tackle in a split-second motion, and it is about mastering your technique. And it's amazing over here how well the players have adapted and how great the coaches have been to take that forward for us. We've got a long way to go.
Yeah, I mean, when we were growing up playing in the 90s, this is probably something that's changed. We overhear people with data to the wrestle or to full-time professionalization, or every team having a dojo or whatever. But you were never told to tackle in the area where head would be on head anyway in junior league, and so it's not something that players don't know. Like when they played as 8-year-olds, they would have been taught this is how you tackle around the legs. And obviously, in a professional environment, they've worked out that gives away too slow a play the ball, and it's sort of a tactical aspect. But it's not a skill that you forgot. Like, you can. I didn't play rugby league for 15 years, and the first thing I could do was tackle. You knew exactly where to put your head around the waist and stuff like that. So I think it's probably not as difficult a skill as we think it is, because every player knows how to do that tackle. If someone's running for a try at the corner, they're going to try that tackle. They're not going to try and tackle them high where their head would be, because it'd be pointless. So I think there is that learning piece is probably not as difficult as we think it is, especially when you've got a real strong incentive not to tackle in that sort of slightly more dangerous area.
Yeah, it's easy in theory when we're sat here, isn't it? But when players are running around at the speed they're running around in, we know they make mistakes. That's the reality. And what we've had to navigate here is, how do you do that in a proportionate way that keeps players with you? We've had a few long bans over here. We had the New Brown send-off, which was wrong. You have to admit things are wrong. And the NRL, however, it bans players for a long time. I saw a player got a 5-week ban by the match review panel for a head tackle recently. We don't have many 5-week bans, even under our new policy. We've had 4 matches for 2 players who hit players significantly high and hard, but they're few and far between. The NRL has higher sanctions and higher fines, and that's how it deals with things. It also has independent doctors, has concussion assessment monitors, it has the bunker dealing with these things. We don't have all that, and therefore we have to do something slightly different to what the NRL does.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece that has been brought up by a few people, and I heard it obviously from yourself talking on the House of League podcast, but the fact that this is all new for the match review panel as well, and it's something that seems to have been kind of fleshed out as round one the players are dealing with, but also come the judiciary are dealing with different frameworks as well, and that's something that the NRL is a constant, there's a never-ending stream of content about was this a 4-week or a 5-week, and that's something that the people in the judiciary have also had to adapt to in the Super League.
Yeah, we tried to make it a little bit more objective and a bit more rugbyfied than talking about recklessness, because recklessness is a legal term which lawyers use. Rugby league players, most rugby league tackles are reckless by their very nature. In a legal definition, most rugby league tackles are reckless. So it's very hard to argue a tackle is not reckless. So then once it hits the head, we talk about a degree of recklessness. Well, to be honest, as a lawyer, I think that's a fallacy. You can't talk about degree of recklessness. And actually, we start conflating recklessness with force and with lots of these phrases that people don't really understand. What you want to try and do is make it about rugby league as much as possible. And I think we're doing that better over here now. But we had some challenge in them first few weeks. And we've had a bit of clarity from our judiciary, from our match review panel. And with any change, it's about knowing that we don't have all the answers. Therefore, asking people to have an opinion, to debate it, and to try and do that in-house. And to be fair to our head coaches, our players now, and our judiciary, they're doing a lot better at that and being open to discussion and adapting during season, which we wouldn't normally do, would we?
Yeah, you say you wouldn't normally do it, but Australia has a long history of changing its rules midway through the season, introducing the 5-meter rule and midway through, and the 6 again and stuff like that. But yeah, in general, I think there's also worth going into there was a couple of trials of this beforehand. So before this year, when it came to Super League, we had this in lower grades. I know there was a game at Bradford where there was 50 penalties or whatever, and a lot of the journalists went down and sort of went a little bit sort of over the top, maybe, given that everybody knew it was a trial, to be like, oh, look at this terrible thing, it's going to ruin the game. And I'm surprised to see maybe that since this is actually coming in the top grade, that it hasn't been as sort of the sky is falling in Chicken Little about it. So maybe explain what the trial was initially and what we look to achieve from that, and sort of how that informed what's taking place now in Super League.
So the trial was not around lowering the tackle height. What the trial was about was reducing head contact. And what we did 12 months before we did the trial, was the Laws Committee, which again is all the stakeholders from across the game, wrote down what they believed would have been basically blue sky thinking. What are the things that we can do that would reduce the amount of contact with the head? And you can say, reduce the number of minutes played, reduce that down, reduce the number of tackles, reduce the tackle height, change the kickoff, moved to 5 meters. So we came up with a list of, say, 10, 12 things. What we did with that list was we then sent that out to match officials, players, head coaches, heads of youth, and other stakeholders in the game, and asked them to rank them from 1 to the bottom with the lowest of what would be the easiest to implement and what would have the most effect. And we then basically ranked them from 1 to 12 based on what the poll suggested. And the 2 things that came out were the easiest to implement was the changing of the kickoff, and the second one was lowering the tackle height. Now, what we know from data of other trials where this has happened in other sports, if you don't sanction on a zero tolerance basis, nothing changes because nobody believes it'll happen. So when we decided to lower the tackle height to armpit, there was a point to the referees of saying, this is zero tolerance. You just go out and penalise everything that goes above the armpit. And yeah, in round 1, we saw ridiculously number of penalties. By round 2, we saw that reduce. By round 3, it flatlined a little bit. And by round 4, it started to go back up. 2 things why that happened. 1, you were asking a group of players to basically put their careers on hold for 8 weeks. So there was no incentive to keep doing this because they didn't know if this would happen forever. And secondly, every other week they went back to the old rules because of a different competition. So it was hard for players to do it. However, what we did see in that trial data was by lowering the tackle height to the armpit, concussions reduced, subconcussive incidents reduced, and the amounts of time that the ball carrier was hitting zone 1 reduced significantly. Now, the irony of that is it actually didn't reduce as much as it has in the first 4 rounds of Super League. So it's amazing how players over here, and probably because the skill is better at Super League than it would have been at Academy, some players have been around a long time, they have longer to prepare for these things. They've managed to reduce that tackle height naturally without a change in the law.
Yeah, and I think it looked like this is going to be a disaster, and it wasn't at all. I think it was quite impressive, really, how the public the first week was like, oh no, this is, we've changed the game as it is, and lots of old people were complaining, and then it doesn't really happen that much now. And I think players have learned that, and I think the punters watching it have learned it as well, where they appear to have noticed that, like, if you want, I'm trying to think of how you describe this, but if I commit a crime, it's on me, right? It's not on the law. And now that we all know what the law is, if someone cracks somebody in the head, you go, well, that's his bad tackle technique. It's not that the fact that last year it might have been only a yellow card and now it's a red, or it wouldn't have been a yellow card and it would have just been a penalty. That people now seem to put that emphasis on the person in question because everybody else kind of has got on board with it.
Yeah, and the big difference is that we over here, like they still do in Australia, believe that head clashes were accidental. But actually, when you strip the law as the laws of the game read back to its simplest, if you hit somebody in the head as a ball, if you're a tackler and you hit somebody in the head, it's a penalty. Now, it doesn't say that has to be with when you're making a tackle. It's any part of your body makes contact with the head, technically under the law. So it's an interpretational thing. Now, what we realized in New Brown was there's different levels of sanction. And what happened was the referee and the video referee felt duty bound under the new framework to have to send that player off. What we were able to do on the back of that decision was go, no, sanction is a penalty. A sanction is a sin bin. A sanction is a red card. Can have different sanctions for different types of offence. But the principle is get your head out of don't come into a tackle upright and get your head out the space of the ball carrier, because it's his head that shouldn't be hit.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that one. It's kind of a funny story, but me and my dad we were in Mudgee, going to like wineries, and we got up to watch that game. Not just me and my dad, my mum was there, my in-laws and all that.
We should say, by the way, that you're both Hull fans.
Yeah, we are both Hull supporters, and New Brown plays for Hull. But I went for a wee because they give a penalty, and I went, well, nothing's happening here. And I went for a wee, and I came back, and I was like, what? He's gone. He's been sent off. But at that time, I thought, well, this is ridiculous. But when you actually, like, obviously, I think it was a bit of a high sanction, but I would say that, But I thought, well, actually, to the letter of the law, he was wrong. Like, the whole purpose of this is change behaviours. And you look now, and the behaviours have changed in when was that, a month ago? And the behaviours have changed. And I think you were really good at it because you went out pretty on the front foot and both saying that, like, okay, so this might have been a slightly egregious response, but there is a point here about what we're trying to change. And I think that public communication aspect has been kind of the most important part. And it's something that we haven't really dealt with here, because if we try and shy away from specific examples that people might not have seen, but everyone will have seen the Reece Walsh one where Taylor May was not charged, when it's exactly the same thing, where it's the duty of care is on him not to have his head where it shouldn't be. And I think that aspect is kind of obvious to anyone who saw that yes, like, it was a head on head, so he didn't mean it, but it's on him not to put his head where that is, because that's what all the data says is wrong. And I just wonder, I know that I mentioned the phrase canary in the coal mine, but that's something that what we can see in Super League is something that I think we're going to see here, because the legal framework and the insurance framework isn't different. And I know lawyers don't like to project into the future of what may or may not happen, because who knows? And it's your job is to interpret what exists and not what might exist. But is that something that you think we can expect to see over here sort of sooner rather than later?
Well, I'm not going to tell you what the NRL are going to do around its own tackle height framework. All I'll say is this, that throughout the last 2 years since I've been in the role I've had, we've had really good working relationships with Graham Annesley and his team, both from an officiating crew perspective, but his medical crew will continue to do that. We'll continue to work with the IRL. Both the RFL and the IRL are in legal claims by players for historic matters. This isn't about a reaction to those claims, but what we're actually trying to do is prevent the players of today bringing that claim in 20 years saying that we didn't look after them. The NRL is doing a lot more things that we're not able to do. Independent doctors, concussion spotters. We've got the mouthguard data. There's different things in different sports that you can do to try and protect players. Do I think that the NRL can find a way to try and encourage players' heads to not be in the same space? Yes. Do I think how they'll do that? I don't know. But I think you've already started to see that messaging coming about a little bit more. I don't think the NRL suffers in the same way that the RFL's Super League does, because it had less 3 and 4 men tackles. It is a lot more hit and whack nowadays in the NRL. And you go back to one of the greatest games we've seen in a long time was Australia-New Zealand at Ellen Road in the World Cup semi-final. There was very little head contact in that game because players mastered the craft of hitting at the right area. Bring that forward now. Wigan played Penrith in the World Club Challenge under what everyone said was different rules. No, just under different sanctioning frameworks, not different rules. We reviewed that game over here under the international framework and under our framework. There wouldn't have been a charge in that game for any high contact. So that tells you that we're not a million miles apart in what we're trying to achieve anyway. But probably the big difference is head on head. And will that change in the NRL? I think eventually it probably will, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have send-offs. And we've not got send-offs for head-on-head collisions over here at the minute. New Brown was a send-off. It was incorrect. We admitted it was incorrect. We also accepted from the coaches that because this was very new, could we look at having a different way of sanctioning them? So where we've got to is, if it's head-on-head collision and the player leaves the field for a head injury assessment, that's got to be at the upper end of force. Therefore, that player will get sin-binned. If it's a head-on-head collision and the player stays on and we see it, we'll penalise it and we'll grade them at grade B and grade C. It's a sanction. It's a marker. But actually, we're not seeing as many head-on-head collisions as we were, even in round 1. And therefore, I think you'll see it in the NRL anyway. Players won't want to put their heads in the same space as someone else soon because they won't want a Reece Walsh incident.
Yeah, I think there's one of the things that's important to point out about this is that the head-on-head stuff, it's not the person doing the tackling is also liable to get hit in the head and get themselves taken out. So the coaches don't want their players getting done for HIAs and missing 15 minutes. Just as, we saw that just at the weekend of recording, Sam Walker being taken off for a HIA for one that he was the tackler. It's just as likely the person making the tackle as the person being tackled. And I think that's, the two incentives working on coaches is not getting players, either sanctioned in game or sanctioned after the game, but also just avoiding head contact. And I think of someone like Victor Radley, who I don't know how many concussions he's had, but I reckon more than half of them are whilst he was the one trying to hit somebody else through getting his head in the wrong place or whatever. You're actually preempting my next question, which is going to be about, we had the World Cup Challenge, which was played under different sanctioning. And as the RFL moves in one direction on this, if the NRL doesn't also move in the same direction, we could end up with a situation come the next World Cup where the British players or the British-based players tackle one way and the Australian, New Zealand-based players tackle another way. And I'm sure that's something that is being thought of at the highest levels because, if I can work it out, I'm sure clever people than me can work it out. But is that something that we're trying to go in lockstep on rather than diverge?
We're working closely with the NRL and the IRL. Whether we'll go in lockstep, I don't know. You've seen our direction travel. We've got a plan of where we're going to go next year. But what we will always do is this is iterative for us. This is about assessing the data as we get it and seeing, have we done enough? Can we do more to make the game safer? I come back to my other point that I said to you earlier. I'm not naive to the fact that rugby league is a high-paced, intense collision sport where we love to see the skillful tries. The unbelievable try that won the New Zealand Warriors game 2 weeks ago, that's a viral clip. We also know that the Tariq Sims on George Williams tackle is a viral clip. We want all them types of things to happen. The irony in our season is that I'll talk you about a player who you'll know at Hull. Franklin Pele got sent off in round 1 of Super League after one of the most amazing hits when he took the player to the floor. He then just had an absolute brain explosion and decided to smash him in the head on the floor. But the first tackle was an unbelievable hit, totally legal. They are things we want to keep in our sport. What we want to do is just reduce the amount of illegal contact that goes on. So and I know the NRL's in that same space. What we just have to make sure is that they'll do some things slightly different to us, and we'll do things because it's what's the resource available to you, what's the current situation in terms of player depth, player squad base, number of concussions and types of mechanics of what happens. You tend to find that both sides of the hemispheres, they change things slightly, they then sort of merge together. The games aren't a million miles apart, especially from a referee interpretation point of view. So whether we'll go in lockstep on head contact, I don't know. But as always, look, we have a very good working relationship with Graham and his team, and it's good to continue to collaborate and learn from each other. As I say, some of the things that we introduced this year, the NRL have been doing for a number of years: concussion spotters, tackle height in the junior game, a modified version of the game for adults that can be a little bit less physical. Potentially independent doctors was something we'd love to get to. So the NRL are ahead of us in so many ways. We might be ahead of them in we've got mouth guards, but we're working with them on different projects and trying to synergize that research because we all want the same thing: a thriving international sport that's watched by millions of people and growing to be better than rugby union, AFL, and all the other sports that are around.
Yeah, I think there's you just touched on it there as well. There's sort of the data aspect. Like, I'm a data guy, very boring about these things, great at parties, etc. Talking about push supports and completion rates and stuff like that. I hate completion rates. But the data on this is like, the way that I had it described to me was like, it's the genie in the bottle, right? Because once you know that this is happening, you can't ignore it. And when you look at, I think of Adrian Morley's high tackle on Robbie Kearns, what was that, 2003, 2001? And you think, Robbie Kearns played on. Like, he played on. And once you know that the dangers of that, the most shocking thing about watching that moment now, which is one of the most viral, celebrated moments in National Rugby League in the last sort of 30, 40 years, is that not that he got sent off, it was that the guy he hit stayed on. And once you know this data and you know the implications of it down the line, which we only learn more and more about, whether that's from rugby league, AFL, NFL, whatever, footballers, heading footballers, like, you can't ignore it once you know it. The way it was described to me was that if we'd have known this 40 years ago, we'd have done something about it, but we didn't. So we didn't. Whereas now we do. We have to do something about it. From a legal perspective,
that's right.
Anything.
But that's right. So that's the legal test: is did you take reasonable steps to make the game safer, knowing what you knew? So when people ask over here about our historic legal claim, a test for somebody who played in the 1970s is a different legal test to somebody who played in the 80s or the 90s or 2000s. What we now know there was the Concussion in Sport Symposium in Amsterdam that talked about head acceleration events. There was one in America this year for American sports. There is research on rugby union players around degenerative diseases linked to contact sports. There's the NFL study that was done in America, and there was one done very recently in football, which showed that footballers, outfield players, get, I think, 3 times more likely to get a brain health-related incident than a goalkeeper who doesn't have to head the ball. So all this tells us is that, in effect, the science and the medicine is starting to tell us there is a dose-related link to how many times you've been hit in the head to the likelihood of you getting some form of brain illness at some point. We now know that. We can't unknow that. We also know, based on data, that 12% of our tackles were making contact with the head. We had to reduce that down. We know that concussions are most reported injury in our sport. We now know that concussions are known as traumatic brain injuries, and we know that traumatic brain injuries have a link to degenerative brain illness. All these things, you just join the dots. You have to make the game as safe as possible. Now, what you also have to accept is players want to play that sport. So if they want to play it and they accept the risk, that's a different legal situation. But for governing bodies around the world, we're all facing this challenge of how do you keep the fabric of your sport there whilst respond to that data?
Rob, I can't think of a better way to end it than that. You've hit every single point that I've heard you say before, and that's why I wanted to get on the podcast. I'd recommend, because I heard you on Matt Shaw's House of League podcast talking about this, and I thought I need to get Rob on because I've never heard it explained so well. So please, if you're interested in Super League, particularly go listen to that because it was really, really good. And it's a bit more specific onto the incident by incident in Super League, which I think if you like Super League, then definitely go for that. Rob, thanks so much for staying up late in England to talk to us about this. It's been really illuminative. That's not a word. It's been really illuminating. So I think this is something that is only going to become a bigger issue. It's something that's difficult to talk about because we all grew up with rugby league as the way that we loved it, and we have to accept that was different, to what it was 10 years before that, and 10 years before that, and 10 years before that, and that rugby league has been unique among sports, I think, in constantly adapting. From 1895 onwards, the rules have changed in various ways, and this is just another way that they're going to change, particularly, with the view of the health of the players. We've often changed the rules of our game to make it more sort of better for supporters to watch, or a better look on TV, and this is something that we need to change to make our players safer, which will help the game go on into the future. So I'm so interested to follow what's happening back home in the UK, because I feel like it's something that we're going to get here in Australia, and it's going to, I don't want to say fundamentally change, but it's going to, I think, improve in the long term how the game looks. And thanks for explaining it to us.
Thanks, Mike. Cheers.